So welcome to the latest episode of Now and Men, a podcast about men, masculinities and gender equality. I'm Sandy Ruxton and I'm here with my co-host Stephen Burrell. And today we're delighted to be talking to Andrea Simon, who is director of the UK-based charity EVAW, which stands for the End Violence Against Women Coalition. Hi Stephen.
Hi Sandy and hi everybody. So EVAW is an umbrella group of feminist organisations and experts working to end men's violence against women and girls. And so it's made up of over 135 specialist women's support services, researchers, activists, survivors, NGOs. And so I believe Andrea has worked at EVAW since 2017. And before that, she campaigned on issues such as child trafficking and modern slavery, and spent more than a decade working for members of parliament as well.
So efforts to tackle violence against women and girls have been widely discussed recently in the UK, particularly following the publication of the Casey review, which described the Metropolitan Police as being riddled with sexism, racism, homophobia. I mean, this independent review was commissioned this is for the benefit of our international listeners, commissioned following the murder 2 years ago by a serving Met officer of a young woman, Sarah Everard, who was just walking home in London. So, welcome, Andrea. It feels like in recent months and years, there's been an endless tide of cases of misconduct, abuse and so on coming to light in the Metropolitan Police and other police forces across the UK. And that suggests that sexism and misogyny remains pretty endemic in the very institutions which are meant to be dealing with this problem. So what are your initial thoughts on the Casey review, and what do you make of the response to it a few days later, the response by the police, by the government itself? Is it a matter of just rooting out some bad apples, as I think the Justice Secretary may have said, or are the problems much deeper, the highly masculinized, patriarchal policing culture? What do you think?
I don't think it's a problem just of a few bad apples. You won't be surprised to hear. It's incredibly important, as you said, to emphasise that this is the latest report. It's come after a stream of other reports and endless, it seems, revelations about police-perpetrated violence against women. But that is not, the only criticism levelled at the police. Obviously, the accusations of racism, institutional racism, homophobia, discrimination, all of these things are things that are stretched back over decades. They're not new concerns, and the report doesn't contain anything that is a surprise to many people working in the violence against women and girls sector like myself. We already knew about the issues with undercover policing, going back to the 80s. The Macpherson report was 20 years ago. As we've said, this report, we need it to initiate something different. So it has to be the start of a tangible shift, I guess, in what we see in UK policing. And we welcome the fact that it has named the Met as having a problem with institutional misogyny, racism and homophobia, because ultimately that naming of the problem is a really important step. And the response from the Met Commissioner, which sort of stopped short of saying that he felt that there was an institutional problem, I think is not ideal, because it feels like there's still some shying away of describing this as something that is very systemic. It's not just about a few corrupt individuals. It is about the institution and the culture of that institution that is enabling perpetrators like Wayne Couzens, like David Carrick, to exist in a way that is not picked up, even though there are numerous red flags or warning signs or very clear reports of abuse. The fact that many of these things were brushed under the carpet, that misconduct cases had found no case to answer, that there wasn't investigations in the case of Couzens into his indecent exposure offending, tells us that the problems are institutional and that there's a widespread issue with how the culture of the Met is allowing people to remain as serving police officers when they really have no business being in the police at all.
Yeah. I was having a look at the report myself, and the issues around sort of lack of trust of the public, lack of confidence in policing, the decline of policing by consent, all of this stuff was so sort of prominent, lack of leadership. It criticises pretty much every facet of the Met's policing, doesn't it? But one of the things I wondered about was the issue of resourcing, because I think it says it in the report that, there were certain units within the police who could pretty much get what they wanted in terms of resources. So, the firearms people, the men working in firearms, they could get specialist night goggles if they wanted them, and so on and so forth. Whereas the resources devoted to tackling violence against women and girls was much, much less. That's right, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. And it's indicative, isn't it, of the prioritisation of violence against women as opposed to other forms of crime. And we're now in a place where we have violence against women as a national strategic and policing requirement, which means that all forces across the country are supposed to have violence against women on the same footing as they do child sexual abuse and terrorism. But even within that promise that we are going to have more attention and more resourcing going towards tackling crimes against women, we see that there's prioritisation even within that. Org is very much at the bottom of the pile. We haven't really seen any evidence of that strategic policing requirement making a difference on the ground. And certainly what was shocking about the Casey report was to hear that you had this complete disregard for rape survivors' evidence, with fridges holding evidence taped together, or allowing evidence to be spoiled because it wasn't considered important enough to ensure that we had functioning equipment. I think that's just a real indictment on how little policing has prioritised, has cared about crimes like rape, sexual violence, domestic abuse. And it just goes to show that as long as we continue to severely sort of underfund and under-resource violence against women and girls as a crime type, but also more broadly as an issue that needs to be prevented, and we need to talk about all the different ways that we should be looking to prevent crimes against women rather than just responding to them after the harm has happened. We just see that we're at the beginning of trying to understand the extent of the problems and the extent of the failures, rather than sort of any way forward in terms of making progress on addressing violence against women.
I mean, given the extent of the criticisms that you've made there, and we mentioned earlier, I'm wondering whether it's actually even possible to reform the police. And of course, Casey herself suggests that if sufficient progress isn't made by some of the sort of review points that are built in, then maybe we should be dividing the Met up into national, specialist, London responsibilities. I mean, I'm wondering whether you think that is something that should happen, or do we just go with the process as it is at the moment and see?
I don't think that anything should be off the table, to be honest. It is a case that the police have to try and earn back the trust and confidence of the public. In London, the Met has significant problems that have been brought to light, and it isn't going to be an easy road to doing that. So I know a number of initiatives have started, and as an organisation, we've been involved in looking at accountability of the criminal justice system for a very long time, and we continue to be part of a number of different scrutiny groups that are trying to look at the solutions that they're put in place and critically evaluate whether we think they are going to work. So I think it's important for there to be some time. We fully understand that the Met and police forces across the country will not transform overnight. It's going to be a process, and I think things will get worse before they get better, because actually what they're doing now, so going back and looking at previous misconduct cases over 10 years and trying to see whether they have people on the force that don't belong there, is going to uncover many more individuals who haven't received the treatment they should have done. So we're going to get to hear more and more about police perpetrated abuse and more cases which go through the criminal system, or cases that lead to officers being dismissed. And this will not help, clearly, public confidence and trust in policing, but it is a necessary thing that has to happen. And part of this is looking at whether the institution has a willingness to really make those kinds of transformative changes, whether the institutions can also be transparent about what they're doing, and if they can actually listen, to the public, to women saying this is what they want, this is what they need in order for there to be any trust or confidence in policing.
Sure. And presumably also that, as I think you've said, there is a balance to be struck for EVAW between, on the one hand, suggesting, and supporting radical change, but at the same time dealing with what's going on in the here and now as well. So, that must be a tricky balance for you.
There are definitely challenges to trying to reform policing to make it work for women and girls when we know that the system is fundamentally broken. It doesn't deliver justice to the vast majority of women who report rape, for example. The rates of prosecution are so low. We can't confidently say it's a deterrent to perpetrators because most cases that are reported are not charged. So you do have to question why so much time and effort is put towards, and resource goes into the criminal justice system when vast majority of women won't report in the first place. And we want to make sure that women who do come forward and want to report to the police are met with a decent service, they're treated with dignity, they have the opportunity to access justice in that way. It should not be denied to anyone who wants to try and get justice through the criminal justice system. And it's not always the case that that women find that they are met with officers who are skilled, who are trained, who have any kind of specialism in sexual violence or domestic abuse. So we think all those things need to change. The institution does need to reform. It does need to ensure that survivors' voices are heard. And that's important to us, but it isn't the whole story. And, there's a lot of other things that need to happen, and a lot of societal change. And survivors have to be able to get the support, particularly the support with mental health, counselling, therapy, which they need in order to cope and recover as well.
Mm. Yeah, and just to add, for the benefit of our international listeners, you mentioned before about David Carrick, and I suppose it just is one example of how deep this problem is, that he was a serving Metropolitan Police officer and he was jailed for life recently after admitting to 85 serious sexual offences against women over 17 years. So the fact that he was able to get away with that and use his status as a police officer, I suppose, just demonstrates the scale of the problem. But as you said as well, I guess, I suppose all of this focus on the police, perhaps, as you said, does put the emphasis very much on dealing with this after it's happened. But as you've said as well, perhaps we also need to be discussing a lot more what we could be doing to stop this from happening in the first place. And I suppose I know that that's something which EVAW emphasises a lot, is the need for more to be done in terms of prevention. So could you perhaps say a little bit about why that is so important for you, and what kinds of things you think we could be doing more of in the UK in order to prevent violence against women and girls from happening in the first place?
And that's really, really important for us to focus on. We continue to see a focus on criminal justice system solutions, but as I've said, the vast majority of women are not reporting to the police at all. And so we have to look at how we reduce and how we prevent these crimes in the first place. And one of the ways that we think it is vital to do that is to focus on the type of education that young people are getting in schools, and that is really equipping them with the tools they need, both to assert their own boundaries and safety, and voice, but also to be respectful and to understand what healthy, equal relationships are all about. And so that does mean that we're giving young people really good quality relationships and sex education, and that we're sort of supporting that by talking to the wider public through public education campaigns about how attitudes that tolerate and minimize violence against women and girls by men are generally sort of harmful for the whole of society, but are also harmful for women and girls. And that, I think, is very key to us trying to prevent more victims becoming victims in the first place. We're starting to see some good work on the front of public campaigning. We've seen initiatives from the Home Office who've had this Enough campaign, which is aimed at challenging men's attitudes and educating the public about how everyone can be bystanders, could safely intervene in situations where they see harassment and abuse. And we have mandatory relationships and sex education in schools, but what we're not seeing is that there is the investment behind that to make sure that that's of a good quality, that it's consistent, that it's across all schools, and we're not seeing enough specialist input as well from experts, particularly women's organisations, experts in violence against women and girls being called upon to really inform that work. And we're also, when we talk to young people, and we've recently surveyed them, we're finding that they also feel that not enough is being done. So in a recent survey that we did, 80% of girls thought that schools needed to do much more to support young people's sex and relationship education and to also tackle sexual harassment that is going on in schools. So there's a huge gap here in that. The resourcing, but also the quality of what's actually being offered.
Yes, and I suppose we have also seen some pushback recently, haven't we, from some MPs questioning whether we should be having, sex and relationships education as it is currently, talking openly about these kinds of things. So I suppose there's always that risk, isn't there, of pushback against this as well. But yeah, and the Everyone's Invited campaign highlighted, didn't it, that actually schools can be spaces which are often not safe for young women and girls in particular when it comes to things like sexual violence and harassment. And I know that, EVAW, you yourselves have recently initiated a campaign, haven't you, called AboutTime, which has a really powerful video, which we'll put in the show notes. I can really recommend everybody checks that out. Could you tell us a bit more about that campaign and what kind of change you'd like to see happen in schools, if they're going to be able to be spaces which are contributing to preventing this?
Yeah, definitely. The hashtag AboutTime campaign, which we launched in January, featured a film that we co-created with young people. So we held several focus groups with girls and young women who talked about their own experiences and informed the content of this film, which really spotlights girls' experiences of sexual harassment in school. It depicts a series of really common experiences, including unwanted sexual touching and the pressure that young people feel to share intimate sexual images. And it focuses on Black and minoritized girls because there are experiences which Black and minoritized girls are having of racialized sexual harassment that we're not talking about enough. And so it's quite important for us to spotlight minoritized girls' experiences and how they're often treated or how their experiences are quite commonly dismissed. So we launched that film, and alongside that, survey results which also talked about girls' experiences of schools. Nearly 3/4 of the young women and girls we surveyed said that they experienced sexist behaviour in school which made them feel uncomfortable. 62% of young women said that comments about their body or uniform had made them feel uncomfortable in particular. And 30% said they didn't feel safe from sexual harassment in schools, which is really quite serious because we want schools to be safe spaces for young people. And so many girls just didn't think school would take reports of sexual harassment seriously and didn't feel safe at school. It was always also interesting to hear what girls had to say about sharing of sexual images, because this is something that in previous reports by Ofsted have called out as being widespread and very normalised amongst young people. And 1 in 4 girls said that they had shared a sexual image of themselves. And of those, 1/4 had said that they'd felt pressure to do so. Almost 1/3 had initially said that they wanted to, but then later they regretted it. So I think it's important for us to be understanding that there are certain pressures being placed on young people, on girls, to do things that they don't feel comfortable with, that they later regret, and that they don't really feel comfortable talking to teachers, talking to adults about either.
Yeah, and I guess that highlights, doesn't it, the need to talk about like gender norms and expectations, right, and how the experiences are different, you know, for girls, for example, and yeah, we need to be able to talk openly about those things as part of like sex and relationships education, I guess.
Yeah, one of the themes we often return to on this podcast is, you know, the contribution that men and boys can make to prevention efforts. I wondered if you had a perspective on that.
I think that I'm not the expert on men and boys, but absolutely they need to play a crucial role in preventing violence against women. I think it's a whole society issue. It's everyone's business to be thinking about it, to be responding to it. But men and boys, I think, have a very important role in terms of holding each other accountable for their behaviour, for their friends, family, colleagues. That can look like just having those conversations when their friends are saying something that, you know, they know it could be understood as sexist, could be making women feel uncomfortable. It could be that they're intervening when they can see friends harassing women. It's about feeling empowered enough to be able to call out things that are misogynistic and not sort of playing into it, normalizing it, and I think that's crucial. But beyond that, I think it's hard to do unless you really have an appreciation of why men have a particular privilege in terms of existing in our society. I know sometimes there can be an automatic sort of reluctance to really sort of accept that, you know, your reality is not the same as a woman or a girl's, but it does start by listening and hearing women and girls when they talk about their experiences and acknowledging that it isn't the same, and we can't occupy space on the same terms as men and boys often. It's not to say that men and boys don't also experience their own issues, their own problems, and issues quite often with violence and abuse. But it is about hearing that women and girls often are in spaces where they don't feel safe and they don't feel free, and that they can't go where they want or do what they want without considering a whole load of different things that are not the same for men. And I mean, I know and I appreciate that there are many men who will hear like the statistics of that apply to violence against women and be quite horrified and say, look, this isn't me. But there's a way in which men can distance themselves from this problem and feel that it isn't necessarily them that are perpetrating it, and so they don't need to have a response. But women can never really distance ourselves from the fear of men's violence. It does actually influence many of our decisions on a daily basis, and so I think it's trying to get that through to most men, so they don't get their sort of backs up and they're not defensive and don't want to say, look, this isn't me. It's all of our issues.
Yeah. And one of the things you highlighted there was the importance of men and boys educating themselves, really, as well as educating and challenging each other, I think. And you know, I'm sure that is an important aspect of this. But I also wondered if there are any particular sort of tensions or problems when men and boys do get involved in this sort of area of work around prevention. You know, I mean, I guess it's possible that, you know, men can try and take over, or they can undermine, you know, women's efforts, women's struggles. I wondered if you had reflections on that.
I think it's really important for men to be speaking to other men and for men to be speaking to boys. And so where there are men and organisations actually forming to do that work, to go into schools and to have those sessions where they are talking about misogyny and they are challenging some of the prevailing sort of sexism that you do see amongst a lot of young boys these days. I think that's really important because they're potentially role modelling a different version of masculinity, which young boys really have to see, they have to be exposed to. So in that regard, I definitely think there's a role and there's a place for men in this. Some of that will look like supporting and amplifying women's voices, but some of it will be really specifically at the front line of this, challenging misogyny, talking about it, giving different examples of masculinity for a younger generation. So there doesn't have to be tensions.
Good.
Yeah, and I mean, on the podcast, we do always like to explore, I suppose, the personal side of doing this work. So I believe I'm right in saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've been involved, you've been working at the End Violence Against Women Coalition since 2017. And I suppose I was just interested in, like what change, I mean, obviously a lot has happened during that time. So like what changes have you observed, over the course of working at EVAW and I suppose working more broadly in the sector, to tackle violence against women and girls? Like, have you noticed any particular shifts over that time in terms of the different issues you've been focusing upon? Or the opposite, have you noticed that there hasn't been anywhere near enough shifts as you'd like to see, perhaps?
There's been a lot of continuity, if I'm honest. We have the same, our goal is not something we believe we can achieve overnight. Ending violence against women and girls is a huge undertaking, and we kind of celebrate the incremental shifts that we see along the way. And in the last 5 years, I've definitely seen lots of those. But we're a long way off the goal. I think one of the significant things has been the national conversation about violence against women, which we've seen that really in the last couple of years, ever since the catalyst that was the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. Violence against women felt like it was less of a mainstream conversation, I guess, before then. And it really got, I think, lots of sort of people talking about women's experiences of having to do safety work and how we just exist in the world differently, which felt new because we have been talking about how this is all rooted in women's inequality, obviously for a very long time, and trying to get that message through. But it felt like it started to be seen and heard in a different way in the last few years. Many of the challenges with the criminal justice system remain just as significant as they did when I started working in this sector. We are uncovering more problems as we go along, and we're seeing the depth of the issues in a new way. So I think there have been changes. I think it's important that the spotlight is on these issues. And I think it's really important that we start to understand what underpins them, rather than just looking at a surface level how we might be able to address this by giving longer sentences or putting more money in street lighting and CCTV. We start to look at actually what are the ways we're going to address the root causes, or how are we going to end and prevent violence against women. And I suppose the other thing that I've seen in the last 5 years is the growth of women being able to use online spaces and platforms to really get across their experiences and their voice. We saw that with Me Too. We've seen that with Everyone's Invited, which gave a platform to girls and young women to talk about abuse at school. And this is an opportunity, I think, for us to hear more of those stories and not to dismiss them, because there's been a groundswell, I think, of women coming forward to say this has happened to me at school, it's happened at work, in public spaces, online. In private life. Like, violence against women and girls impacts all facets of women and girls' lives. and throughout their lives as well, starting from when they were a girl at school, all the way through university, work, at every stage of life. And we're starting to see that more clearly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, connected to that, I mean, doing this work, confronting this, I suppose, the ongoing pervasiveness of men's violence against women, on a day-to-day basis must be incredibly hard, exhausting work for you. So, I mean, what would you say keeps you motivated to keep doing this work? What keeps you hopeful? Like, is there anything in particular which gives you the kind of inspiration to keep the struggle going, I guess?
It is difficult work, and we come at it, and I come at it from a point of not seeing violence against women as an inevitable part of life. My ideal is to work towards a society where women, girls of all different backgrounds are living without the fear and the threat of men's violence. And I think I'm going to weirdly turn the sort of backlash to women's rights on its head a little bit and say that also motivates me. I think that wherever there is progress, there is some degree of backlash that happens. And I think we've seen that in response to Me Too, and in the way that, people have got behind Not All Men. And, I've even seen recent polling that's suggesting that younger generations feel that women's rights movements have gone too far and are now discriminating against men. And I feel to some extent that backlash is reflecting that changes are afoot in society, and that we're actually starting to feel the impact of women's voices and how women's experiences are now being more centred and being the topic of conversation. And also the object of policy making and lawmaking. And that makes me feel, I think, slightly more hopeful that changes are happening and shifts are happening in society, and that we're going to get to a place, maybe in my lifetime and hopefully my children's, that gender equality is the new standard, and that we are making huge strides in addressing all of the inequalities that women currently experience, whether that's economic or social, or in relation to different types of violence and abuse.
No, absolutely. I know as well that one of the things EVAW really emphasises, I suppose, is the need for a kind of intersectional, anti-racist approach to tackling violence against women and girls. So could you tell us a bit more about, what does that mean, and why is that so important in your eyes as part of this?
Well, I think if you say that you're going to be there for or stand up for women's rights and equality, you need to mean all women, and intersectionality needs to be practiced, and it needs to be part of the way that you think about the problem and what the solutions are. So, for example, the way that we work is we think about women's, different characteristics when we plan our work. We know that there isn't one size fits all as an approach to support or justice, and that different women have different help-seeking journeys, and that's impacted by race, by disability, by sexuality, all of the different things that make up our complex and wonderful lives, will inform our own experiences of violence and abuse, and will inform our ability to access justice, or to access the support and services that we need. So from our point of view, an intersectional approach is vital. It helps us to understand the really important work that specialist women's organisations that are run by and for Black and minoritised women and migrant women and other marginalised communities are so important to fund, to ensure exist, because they are supporting women who are on some of the harshest ends of being impacted by misogyny, sexism, violence and racism, disableism, etc. So we have to ensure that those who are facing the greatest barriers, I guess, are supported. And so that's why I think an intersectional approach and an anti-racist approach to tackling violence against women is vital. So I joined others across the violence against women and girls sector to set up something called the Anti-Racism Working Group. And that was specifically to address racism within the structures, the practices, and the behaviours of our own organisations that are supporting victims and survivors of male violence. Collectively, we produced an anti-racism charter for our sector, and that was signed up to by many individuals working across the violence against women and girls sector, but also organisations, and it committed them to addressing racism within the organisation, and also to challenging racist systems and structures. And it was really important because it helped us to look inward and say, we are challenging racism and misogyny and sexism externally, but this is also an issue for our own sector, within the charity sector, but specifically for women who are trying to work to challenge men's violence. And we've helped to train and to educate lots of women and lots of organisations around how to implement the commitments of the Anti-Racism Charter and actually do anti-racist work, which is quite distinct from equality, diversity and inclusion work. And I think that's been very key for us to get across, that we are dissecting power and power relationships as they pertain to race in the same way that we dissect power relationships as they pertain to gender inequality and relationships between men and women.
I mean, I wanted to ask you a more specific thing, which is about the position of migrant women, and I think I'm right that EVAW's been working on the issues they face as well. I mean, in a way, that it seems like a sort of contradiction within government discourse. So on the one hand, we're going to clamp down on violence against women, and there's a lot of tough words about perpetrators, etc., and yet, there's a whole sort of anti-immigration, anti-migrant rhetoric going on at the same time, and the practice is pretty scary in terms of what migrant women in particular are facing. I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about that and your campaigning around that issue.
We feel that the government has failed to protect migrant women in the same way that they've sought protections for other victims, for example, of domestic abuse. Migrant women were left out of the Domestic Abuse Act in a very significant way because they were not afforded the same protections as other women. And we've been calling that out for a number of years alongside our colleagues who are the experts in supporting women, such as Latin American Women's Rights Service and Southall Black Sisters. So not only are migrant women being left out of the same sort of protections when they are victims of abuse, and we don't have a government who fully acknowledges the impact of a woman's insecure immigration status and the relationship that can have to abuse, because perpetrators will often take advantage of that and use that as a way to coerce and control their partners. We also have the government at the same time weaponising violence against women in order to pursue an agenda which we think is attacking of migrants. In recent years, we've seen this happening by politicians pushing through anti-refugee laws, right up to the current day, and not recognising the experiences of women who've been abused and safeguarding those women. So these laws, we feel, are putting survivors of gender-based violence at risk of further harm and violence, and that they're undermining fundamentally the government's broader commitments to tackle violence against women by singling out or excluding one group of people from rights-based protections. When the government starts to do that and we start to accept it, essentially we're eroding the universal nature of human rights, which is incredibly worrying to us.
I wanted to go back to something you were saying a little bit earlier about Backlash, because in the sort of men and boys world, there's been a lot of focus on the activities, obviously, of Andrew Tate, the kind of extreme misogyny that he and others have been propagating and allowed to spread on social media. I mean, obviously, people like him have a significant reach, and in a way, they're just the latest in a long history of a small but sort of vocal minority of men condemning gender equality and seeing themselves as the new victims, as you said a minute ago. But do you think there's something particularly new and worrying about the phenomenon of people like Andrew Tate?
Yeah, I definitely do, and I know that many of us until sort of last summer, probably hadn't ever heard of this individual, and he has he amassed a huge following really rapidly online, and I think many parents, for example, were really caught unaware that he was becoming quite so influential of their children, and I say myself, I was very late to understanding quite how prolific his content had become online, and hadn't realised that my own teenage son had been absorbing this. And when we had a conversation about it, he was very ready with the defence of Andrew Tate and his content, and was telling me that he felt that he was misunderstood in many ways now. So that all came as a bit of a surprise. I think it was quite rapid, this rise of this influence of this individual. But yes, I think that we've been left sort of having to clean up the mess that the internet companies have created in a way by allowing this content to proliferate so quickly and so without any restriction whatsoever. And we've seen the impact of that in schools, with teachers really feeling very unequipped to be able to challenge some of the misogynistic content that boys were consuming and sort of repeating. So I think we have to be very, very attentive to the kind of content that misogynistic influencers are spreading online, and joining the dots as well between that and the real life implications of that content on the behaviour and the beliefs of boys and young men, and the impact that also has around encouraging the harassment, abuse, and coercive control within relationship settings of girls and women. I think one thing we haven't talked much about is the impact it has had on girls. We talk a lot about how Andrew Tate's content has impacted boys and the way that they think about gender and girls and women's roles. But girls are also consuming this, and they're also questioning their own behaviour, and it's also influencing what they think is appropriate behaviour for them in relationships. And you can call it internalised misogyny almost, but I'm hearing more and more that's an issue for girls grappling with all of this information that they're also being fed.
Yeah. No, that seems like a very important point, and I'm sure you're right that we need a lot more to be done to tackle online abuse of women and girls, and increase regulation through tech platforms that perpetrators use. The whole burgeoning of the manosphere, really. But as I understand it, women and girls aren't mentioned in the online safety bill. Is that the case? And what more can and should be done about it? Where are we at with the online safety bill?
So the online safety bill is currently in the House of Lords, and we have been campaigning with partners to try and get the bill to introduce a violence against women and girls code of practice for internet and social media companies. We think this is a really important way that we can ensure that internet companies and social media can take responsibility and accountability for preventing and addressing the abuse that is on their platforms, that they often profit from because this information and content is shared so widely. We need them to be looking at things like how to ensure that their platforms are safe by design, and we need them to have better standards when it comes to enforcing their terms and conditions, and that those terms and conditions are of a decent standard across all platforms. And that's where we feel that the online safety bill really falls short and lets down women and girls who've experienced online abuse. So we're hoping that there's an amendment that will go into the online safety bill in the House of Lords that will be passed, that will ensure that there is a code that is mandated which relates to violence against women and girls. There are currently other codes in the bill. and they relate to other issues, but nothing on violence against women and girls. As you say, it isn't mentioned at all in this bill.
And one thing which goes through my mind a lot with this is, like, you know, how much of the internet is the influence of pornography, right? Which often is putting out there quite narrow, sexist, misogynistic ideas about sex and sexuality and stuff, and how that influences online spaces. But yeah, I mean, obviously we are in a period of quite significant political flux, as always, in the UK. So I suppose, you know, we are supposed to be having a general election, I think, in a year or so's time. And yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts about, you know, do you see any differences on the horizon in terms of how violence against women and girls, you know, will be tackled by an incoming government in the future? Like, do you think it would make it? I see Keir Starmer's made a speech today about how he wants to see, like, violence against women and girls halved in 10 years and things like that. I mean, do you think that these kind of political shifts could make a difference in your view? Or yeah,
I think yes, it's important right now when we're thinking about an upcoming election that violence against women and girls is part of manifesto commitments. We want to see that this breadth of support there is within the, you know, the public domain for doing something about violence against women. That we want to see all these national conversations that we've been having about women's safety translated into ensuring that the government have the political will to finally really do something about this. So it should be a central election issue. If we keep prevention at the heart, we can start to then see that solutions will come out rather than some of the PR announcements that you've seen, which are very short term. They are about putting money into street lighting and CCTV, as I've mentioned before, and they fail to get to the root of the problem, and therefore will not transform the experiences of women and girls today. So we need to see very sort of radical thinking from our politicians and a demonstration they really understand what it will take to end violence, rather than quick fixes or sound bites or things they think is going to please the public. And we do want to see that there are some survivors who are not left out of the promises that are being made now and will be made by whoever's in government next. So those issues for migrant women, where we've talked about them being excluded from provisions that support other survivors of abuse, have to be addressed. And we don't want to see that incredibly harmful rhetoric around refugees and other migrants being prioritised over the safety, the dignity, and the treatment of survivors of violence and abuse. But I think we've also come out of a situation where politics has been very messy and difficult. Like in the last year, we've had 3 prime ministers, and we've had some significant delays to bits of legislation, some of which we've talked about: the online safety bill, the victims bill, which has still not appeared, I believe is very soon to appear, but we've been waiting for that for a very long time. So it has had a knock-on effect, the political instability, on being able to further bits of legislation that would improve the lives of victims and survivors of violence and abuse. So we're still grappling with the fallout of all of that, and looking to politicians to make good on the promises they've been making for a while now, but we haven't really seen that much change, that much difference on the ground.
Yeah. Well, the last question, just quickly, I had was just EVAW is a kind of avowedly feminist organisation, and perhaps that is something which might be quite hard for organisations to say openly these days. You know, there's a lot of pressure to be professionalised, like politically neutral, gender neutral. Also, the backlash you've mentioned as well. I mean, do these things create obstacles, you know, for you in the work you do? Like, how do you navigate those tensions, and why is it that actually saying, you know, being openly feminist is really important in your eyes?
I think that probably some of the greatest risks come with a lack of recognition of the role that gender plays in terms of violence and abuse, both prevalence and solutions-wise. We're really clear that this is an issue that disproportionately impacts women and girls and is disproportionately perpetrated by men and boys, and so we have to be clear about that. We have to name that. And for us, it's so fundamentally tied in with women's equality, and seeing that as the cause and consequence of violence and abuse. And those messages won't change, and they have to be centred, I think, in any solutions, because if we don't acknowledge that the problem is men's violence against women, then we're just talking about violence in general, and that's not going to help ensure that we're addressing who is committing the violence and dealing with that. I mean, when you think about some of the most progressive and transformative actions that have come out of the government's rape review, which was trying to look at how we transform the response to rape victims in the criminal justice system, it has been that message through Operation Soteria, which is a police and CPS program looking at how to improve both investigation and prosecution of rape. It has been to identify that we need to focus on the suspects and have good suspect-centric investigations. Previously, or what we still see actually, is an undue focus on women who've reported rape, on their credibility, on their characteristics, their behaviour, and that has to shift. And I think we've just, in general, got to shift from thinking about women and girls as being, and their action as being the solution to male violence, and to think about men and boys, and to look at how we place the onus on them to address their behaviour, their actions, and to hold other men and boys accountable. It's very important for us to be clear about that and to keep that in mind when we're talking about this issue all the time.
Well, thank you. That's a highly relevant message for our podcast. So thank you so much for giving up your time and for all the amazing work you're doing. It's so much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea, for coming on. It's very good to hear you talking about all these different topics and what you're doing.
No, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Sandy, it feels like we're recording this episode at quite an important time here in the UK, really, given that the Casey report has just come out and has really shone a light on the extent to which sexism and misogyny, racism, homophobia are kind of entrenched within policing and actually in society more broadly as well. What did you make of the conversation with Andrea?
Yeah, sure, Stephen. That's right. I mean, I've had a read of some of the 300 and plus pages of the Casey review, and really it's a pretty, as many people have said, a pretty stark read. There's some very disturbing evidence there of particularly the things that female officers, black officers have to put up with in the Met. And the report does highlight the existence of the sort of boys' club culture, I think particularly in the sort of specialist areas, and that, as it says, the more male dominated the command, the less women seem to be able to break through. And there's material in there suggesting, a third of women in the Met, responding to a survey carried out for the review, have experienced sexism at work. 12% report directly experiencing sexual harassment as well. So it's a pretty harrowing read, really, and I'm avoiding sort of giving some of the quotes, which just demonstrate how bad it is. Listeners can look at that themselves if they want to. We'll put a link in the show notes. But I think it's worth just sort of dwelling for a moment on some of the recommendations as well, because there are some specifically in relation to improving the situation of women and girls and preventing them being victims of violence and abuse. So in particular, the report highlights the importance of dedicated women's protection services and also that there should be teams to deal with rape in particular and serious sexual offences. And it suggests a children's strategy for London as well. So, those haven't really received so much attention, but I think it'd be worth thinking about those elements. Anyway, I've said quite a bit there, but perhaps you want to add to that, Stephen.
Yeah, well, I think one thing which comes to my mind, which I feel like people aren't really talking about that much, certainly outside of the kind of, amazing organisations like EVAW, is how deep-rooted these problems are, really, in terms of like thinking about the culture and how much needs to change there, and how it is really a root and branch issue. That this is such a masculinized, patriarchal policing culture that we have, right? And actually, in some ways, you can see how that might have got worse over time rather than better. If we think about previous episodes of the podcast and how the influence of militarism on society and how our police forces are increasingly militarized in many cases, and how that projects certain ideas about masculinity. But I suppose at the same time, I think it's also important not to think that this is a problem limited to the police, as problematic as the issues there are, because actually, those kind of cultures exist way beyond the police and in our society, and so I think that's something which all of our institutions and workplaces could reflect on, about how do these problems manifest themselves in all of our organisations, and what can we do to change them. I suppose one thing there as well, which comes to my mind, so I suppose sometimes it feels like some of the initiatives which are being proposed to tackle this feel like they're just scratching the surface, really. It's the same goes for schools, for example. Obviously sex and relationships education is really important and necessary. But actually, the kinds of culture and norms that boys are learning from a young age extends well beyond that, even just within the school campus. And I know that's one reason why EVAW, campaigned for a kind of whole school approach to preventing violence against women and girls for that reason. And I think that we need to reflect on this on a more personal level as well, right? As men, to look quite profoundly at ourselves, right, and think about how have we been influenced by this kind of culture, because I think we can just see all around us still, that this idea that men should have more power than women, that men should have power over women. We're learning that all around us all the time, and that does manifest itself in all sorts of different ways, in our relationships, in sex, in the workplace, at school, all around us. And I think that's an ongoing thing which we all need to kind of reflect on and unpick and challenge in ourselves as much as anything, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, you've made me think whilst you were talking there of not wanting to blow our own trumpet, of course, but I'm just about to. An article that you and I wrote with Nicole Westmoreland for The Conversation, and this is 2 years ago, about Sarah Everard and how we can all help change masculinized workplace. A lot of the things that you just said about workplaces being male dominated and the constructions of masculinity within the workplace, there's a lot that needs to change more generally, not just in the police. I mean, for example, the cultures are often still based around a sort of ideal male, in brackets, male worker, and career progress can be linked to full-time continuous employment, and women's lives are often not fitting those patterns so much. So, there's lots that can change.
Did you have any reflections as well on being a parent and the role parents can play in this?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. I mean, Andrea did mention the conversation that she had with her son, I think, her teenage son, about Andrew Tate, and she said her son, to an extent, was defending Tate. And I guess those kinds of conversations may be going along in many, many families around the country and probably internationally as well. And I also know from my own experience how difficult it is to deal with some of these issues, and how you need to sort of, well, I felt I needed to tread a fine line between not sort of writing off opinions and closing down debates, which I thought weren't worth it, if you see what I mean, but at the same time maintaining dialogue, dialogue with teenagers, particularly teenage boys, is a difficult thing for parents to maintain, but it's actually absolutely critical to making progress in these areas, I think.
Yeah, and feeling able to talk openly about these things. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, well, yeah, we should probably stop there for this episode. But thank you so much, as always, to all of our listeners for tuning in. And do contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you have questions or comments. As always, please do subscribe and share the podcast with your friends. And we will be speaking to you again soon, hopefully. Thank you.
Yes, and it's goodbye from me as well. So talk to you soon.
Bye. Bye.